In the winter of 1887, a crew of 30 men stood at the edge of a Louisiana cypress swamp and tried to solve an impossible problem. They needed to move trees that weighed 4 tons each through water that was waist-deep, across ground that couldn't support a man's weight, let alone a loaded wagon. The nearest solid ground was 3 miles away. The nearest railroad was 12. So they built a road out of the same trees they were trying to haul. They cut cypress logs 8 to 12 inches across and laid them side by side across the swamp, crosswise, perpendicular to the direction of travel. Then they sank them into the mud until they stopped moving. That road lasted 18 months before it rotted back into the earth it came from. By then, they'd pulled out 2 million board feet of timber and left behind a trail of drowned mules, broken men, and an engineering solution so obvious and so brutal that it defined an entire era of American industry. This is the story of corduroy roads and pole roads, the wooden railroads that shouldn't have worked but did, the system that turned swamps into sawmills and killed men in ratios that would horrify modern safety inspectors, and the workers, many of them formerly enslaved people or their descendants, who built roads from trees to move trees, in water that bred disease faster than it bred profit. Before we had engines powerful enough to work in swamps, before we had equipment that could float, before we understood that some timber wasn't worth the cost in human life, we had this. And it worked, until it didn't. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when someone looked at a cypress swamp and saw money instead of misery. The problem was simple. The solution was insane. By the 1870s, the big pine forests of the South were starting to thin. Loggers had taken the easy timber, the trees on solid ground near rivers and roads. What remained was harder to reach, and the hardest timber of all was in the swamps, cypress swamps, places where the ground was more water than earth, where a man could sink to his chest in mud, where snakes outnumbered trees and mosquitoes outnumbered both. But the cypress was worth it. These trees were old. Not decades old, centuries old. A cypress in a Louisiana swamp might be 1,000 years old. Some were 2,000. They'd been growing since before the Norman Conquest. Their wood was naturally rot-resistant, immune to insects, and so dense it barely floated. Perfect for shingles, perfect for siding, imperfect for anything that needed to last. The trees were there, the market was there. The problem was getting one to the other. You couldn't float cypress out the way you floated pine. Cypress was too dense. It barely floated even when freshly cut, and once it started to dry, it sank. You couldn't drag it with mules because the ground wouldn't hold a mule's weight. You couldn't build a road because there was nothing to build on. The mud went down, 6 feet, 8 feet, sometimes 12. There was no bedrock, no solid bottom, just water and decomposing vegetation that had been accumulating since the last ice age. So someone, and history doesn't record who, had an idea that was either genius or desperation. Probably both. Build the road out of logs, not boards, not planks, whole logs. Lay them crosswise, like railroad ties without the rails, and sink them into the mud until they stop sinking. Then put another layer on top if the first layer isn't high enough. Drive wagons over them, drag logs over them, work them until they rot, which won't take long in a swamp, and then build another road. They called it corduroy, because when you looked at it from the side, the pattern of logs looked like corduroy fabric. Parallel ridges. That's where the pleasant part of the comparison ended. Riding on a corduroy road was like riding on a washboard. Every log was a separate jolt. A wagon moving at walking speed would rattle your teeth loose. The logs were never exactly the same diameter, never perfectly aligned, never quite stable. They shifted under weight. They developed gaps. After rain, they became slick as ice. After sun, they split and splintered. And they were everywhere you needed to go in a cypress swamp. Here's how you built one. First, you found the route. Not the best route, the only route. The path through the swamp that was shallowest, that had the fewest deep pools, that connected your timber to your mill. That route might zigzag for 5 miles to cover 2 miles of straight-line distance. You didn't care. You weren't building for efficiency. You were building for survival. Then you started cutting. Not the big cypress you came for. Smaller trees. 8 to 12 inches in diameter. Young cypress, pine, whatever would hold weight. You cut them in 12-foot lengths, sometimes 16 if you needed to span particularly soft ground. You trimmed the branches but left the bark. The bark helped them grip each other, helped them resist rot for a few more months. Then you laid them, perpendicular to your direction of travel, side by side, as tight as you could get them. A road 20 feet wide might take 200 logs per 100 feet of length. You did the math. For a mile of road, you needed over 10,000 logs just for the first layer, and you always needed a second layer, because the first layer sank. Always. The weight of the logs themselves, plus the weight of whatever you were trying to haul, pushed them down into the mud. Sometimes they sank 6 inches. Sometimes they sank until only the tops were visible. You waited. Let them settle. Let the mud compress. Then you added another layer on top. Same process. Crosswise logs, packed tight. That second layer didn't sink as far. Usually. Sometimes you needed a third. The men who built these roads worked waist deep in water. In summer, that water was warm enough to breed disease. In winter, it was cold enough to give you hypothermia after an hour. They stood in it for 10 hours a day. They cut logs while standing in it. They carried logs while walking through it. They hammered wedges and adjusted positions with water up to their armpits. And they were always aware of what else was in that water. Water moccasins, cottonmouths, snakes that were aggressive instead of defensive, that would swim toward you instead of away. A bite wouldn't kill you immediately, but it would put you in a fever, and fever in a swamp camp was often a death sentence on its own. There were alligators, though they mostly left the work crews alone. Mostly, there were snapping turtles big enough to take off fingers. There were leashes that would attach to any exposed skin and had to be burned off with cigarettes. But the real killer was smaller, mosquitoes, and the diseases they carried. Yellow fever killed more swamp loggers than accidents. Malaria killed more than both. The symptoms started the same way. Fever, chills, ache in your bones that felt like they were breaking from the inside. Then yellow fever turned your skin the color of old paper, and malaria put you in cycles of fever so high you hallucinated. Both killed you if you didn't get to a doctor, and the nearest doctor was usually 2 days away by boat. Swamp logging camps didn't keep careful records of disease deaths. They kept records of production. How many board feet cut? How many logs hauled? How many miles of corduroy road laid? Men were replaceable. Timber was money. But even money had limits, and the limit for corduroy roads was time. A corduroy road in a cypress swamp lasted 1 to 3 years. Then it rotted. The logs broke down, turned soft, became part of the swamp again. You could extend the life a little by using cypress for the road itself, since cypress resisted rot better than pine. But even cypress gave up eventually. The water won. It always won. So you built another road, sometimes right on top of the old one, using the rotted logs as a base, sometimes offset by a few feet, using fresh ground. You built and rebuilt and built again, chasing timber deeper into the swamp, until the timber ran out or the company ran out of money or both. But corduroy roads had a problem beyond rot. They couldn't handle the weight of the biggest logs. A mature cypress, just the kind that made the whole operation worthwhile, could be 8 feet in diameter at the base, 60 feet tall before the first branch. When you cut it, trimmed it, and dragged it out, it weighed 4 tons, sometimes 6. A corduroy road could handle wagons, it could handle mules. But when you tried to drag a 4-ton log across those cross-laid logs, the road disintegrated. The logs snapped, the whole surface collapsed into the mud below. So they invented something worse, pole roads. A pole road was the same concept as corduroy, but inverted. Instead of logs laid crosswise, you laid them lengthwise, parallel to your direction of travel. 2 long poles, sometimes 4, stretching from your cutting site to your mill. Each pole was a single tree, 60 feet long, stripped of branches, laid end to end with the next pole to create a continuous track. The wagon or sled ran on top of those poles. The wheels or runners stayed on the poles the entire route. No variation, no deviation. You followed the poles or you went into the swamp. Pole roads required more engineering than corduroy. The poles had to be level. If one pole was higher than the other, your wagon would tip. They had to be parallel. If they spread apart or came together, your wheels would slip off. And they had to be supported every 10 feet. Because unlike corduroy, pole roads didn't have dozens of logs sharing the weight. 2 poles carried everything. So you built supports, short cross pieces sunk into the mud beneath the poles, like railroad ties. Then you sunk posts next to those cross pieces, driven down until they hit something solid or until you gave up. Then you notched the poles and fitted them onto the supports. It was carpentry in a swamp. Every joint had to be tight, every support had to be stable, and all of it had to be done while standing in water. The advantage of a pole road was capacity. You could drag the biggest logs over poles because the weight was distributed along a line instead of across a surface. A 4-ton cypress would crush a corduroy road, but it would roll right over poles. If the poles held. They didn't always hold. When a pole road failed, it failed catastrophically. A support would give way, the pole would drop, the wagon or sled would tip sideways and go into the swamp, taking its load with it. Recovering a 4-ton log from 8 feet of mud was barely possible. Recovering it without losing the mules trying to pull it out was nearly impossible. So sometimes you left it, marked the spot, moved on. The swamp kept more timber than it gave up. But the real innovation in swamp logging wasn't the roads. It was what moved on those roads. Mules. Specifically, mules instead of horses. Horses are stronger. Horses are faster. But horses panic. A horse in a swamp, standing on a pole road with water on both sides, will panic at the first loud noise or sudden movement. It will try to bolt. When it bolts on a pole road, it goes sideways into the swamp. Once a horse is in the swamp, thrashing and drowning and pulling against its harness, you have about 10 minutes to get it out before it dies. Most of the time, you didn't. Mules were different. Mules were sure-footed. Mules didn't panic. A mule would stand on a pole road, absolutely still, waiting for instructions. When a mule stepped, it stepped deliberately, testing the surface before committing its weight. Mules understood danger in a way horses didn't. They understood that the water on either side of the poles was not somewhere you wanted to go. But even mules died. Mule mortality in swamp logging camps ran 20 to 30% per season. Not per year. Per season. The logging season in cypress swamps ran from fall through winter, when water levels dropped and the ground firmed up slightly. 4 to 6 months. In that time, a camp with 20 mules would lose 5 or 6. They drowned. They broke legs stepping wrong on a pole road. They were bitten by snakes and died from infection. They caught diseases from the water. They were worked until they collapsed. Yes, and then they were left where they fell because getting a dead mule out of a swamp was more trouble than buying a new one. A mule cost $15 to $30. A man earned $1 to $1.50 per day, plus room and board. The math was brutal and obvious. Mules were more valuable than men. You could replace a man in a week. Training a new mule took months. And yet the men kept coming. Many of them were formerly enslaved people, or their descendants. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction collapsed, after sharecropping turned out to be slavery with a different name, swamp logging offered something rare. Cash wages, not credit at the company store, not a share of the crop that somehow never added up. Actual money. $1 a day was more than most black workers in the South could earn anywhere else. The work was brutal. The conditions were inhuman. The mortality rate was appalling, but it was a job that paid in cash, that didn't require you to bow and scrape to a white landowner, that let you walk away at the end of the season with money in your pocket if you survived. Some men came back year after year. They learned the swamps. They learned which snakes to avoid and which you could work around. They learned to recognize the early symptoms of malaria and dose themselves with quinine before it got bad. They learned to build corduroy roads that lasted an extra 6 months, to lay pole roads that didn't collapse, to handle mules in water without drowning either the mule or themselves. These men were the reason the system worked, not the engineers who designed it, not the company owners who financed it. The men who stood in the water and built roads from trees and died from diseases that had been curable in cities for a decade. And what they built was remarkable, not morally, practically. By the 1890s, there were thousands of miles of corduroy and pole roads threading through the swamps of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. Some connected to actual railroads. Some connected to rivers where you could float logs downstream. Some connected to nothing except other swamp roads, creating networks that existed only on company maps and in the memories of the men who built them. The roads didn't last, but while they did, they moved timber that couldn't be moved any other way. A good crew could lay a quarter-mile of corduroy road in a week. A great crew could do a half-mile. The road would last 2 years, maybe 3. In that time, you'd pull out enough timber to justify the cost of building it. Then the road would rot, the crew would move deeper into the swamp, and you'd start over. It was sustainable only in the sense that the swamp seemed endless. They weren't. But it took 30 years to figure that out. The peak of swamp logging came in the first decade of the 1900s. By then, the techniques were refined. Companies knew how to build roads that lasted. They knew how to train mules. They knew which trees to cut and which to leave. They knew how to minimize losses from disease by screening the camps and dosing workers with quinine. They got efficient. And efficiency in swamp logging meant more dead men per 1,000 board feet, not fewer, because the companies pushed deeper, into swamps that were wetter, darker, more remote, into places where the nearest solid ground was 5 miles away instead of 3, where the water never dropped below waist deep, even in winter, where yellow fever was endemic and malaria was guaranteed. They pushed because the easy cypress was gone. The trees near the edges of the swamps, the ones you could reach with a half-mile of corduroy road, had been cut in the 1880s. What remained was deeper, older, more valuable, and more expensive to reach. So the roads got longer. A mile became 3 miles, became 5. Crews laid corduroy through water that was shoulder deep. They built pole roads that curved and switchbacked because straight lines crossed water too deep for supports. They invented pull boats. Pull boats were a solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed. When the water was too deep for roads, even pole roads, you needed something that floated. But cypress logs barely floated, and you couldn't build a raft big enough to carry a 4-ton log. So you built a boat with a steam-powered winch. The boat was flat-bottomed, 20 feet long, 8 feet wide. It sat in the water like a barge. On the deck was a boiler and a steam engine that powered a winch. The winch had a steel cable that could pull 10 tons. You anchored the boat to a tree or drove pilings into the mud to hold it in place. Then you ran the cable out to your log, half a mile away in the swamp, and you pulled. The log came to you, slowly, through water, over mud, tearing up everything in its path. It took hours, sometimes days, but it worked. Steam skidders were similar but stayed on land, or what passed for land. They were steam engines mounted on sleds, or with winches that could pull logs from places mules couldn't reach. You set up the skidder on solid ground, or the firmest ground you could find, and you ran cables out into the swamp. Then you pulled. Both systems required men in the water. Someone had to attach the cable to the log. Someone had to clear debris from the path. Someone had to watch for snags and obstacles and signal the operator when to stop. Those men worked waist-deep in water that was cold in winter and warm enough to breed disease in summer. They worked in water that hid snakes and alligators and 100-pound snapping turtles. And they died. Not always from dramatic causes. Sometimes they just got sick. Fever that started as a chill became a fever that killed you in 3 days. A small cut that got infected in swamp water became gangrene. Exhaustion became collapse, became death, because there was no way to get you out fast enough to save you. The companies kept minimal records. Production records were detailed. Deaths were noted only when they affected production. If a man died but his crew kept working, it often wasn't recorded at all. Historians estimate that swamp logging in the peak years, 1900 to 1920, killed between 500 and 1,000 men per year. That's an estimate. The real number was probably higher. But here's what we know for certain. The timber came out. Millions of board feet per year. Cypress that had been growing for 1,000 years was cut. dragged through swamps on roads made of younger trees, and turned into shingles and siding and railroad ties. The wood was perfect, naturally rot-resistant. It lasted decades. Some of it is still in use today, in houses that are over 100 years old. That wood was bought with lives. Not metaphorically, literally. Every 1,000 board feet represented a calculated risk that someone would die getting it to market. The companies knew the mortality rates. They built them into their costs. A dead worker cost a day of lost production plus the price of bringing in a replacement. It was cheaper than building safer roads. And then it ended. Not because anyone decided it was too dangerous, not because workers refused to do it, because the timber ran out. By 1920, the big cypress was gone. The trees that had survived 1,000 years were cut in 40. The swamps that had seemed endless were empty. Stumps rotted in water that was starting to clear because there were no more roots to hold the sediment. The roads rotted. The pull boats were abandoned. The camps were dismantled. The men who had worked those swamps moved on. Some went north to the industrial cities where factories were hiring. Some stayed south and worked in the pine forests that were being replanted. Some died of malaria or yellow fever years after they left the swamps, carrying the disease with them. No one built monuments, no one recorded their names. The companies kept production records, but not personnel records. We know how many board feet came out of the Atchafalaya Basin between 1895 and 1920. We don't know the names of the men who drowned getting it out. What remains are the stumps. Cypress stumps in Louisiana swamps, cut 4 feet above the waterline because that's where the sawyers stood. Some of those stumps are still there, still rotting. 100 years later, a cypress resists decay long enough that you can see the saw marks. You can see where the men stood. You can see the notches they cut to position their saws. You can see the evidence of their work, but not the evidence of their lives. The corduroy roads are gone, rotted back into the swamps they came from. The pole roads are gone. The pull boats rusted and sank. The steam skidders were salvaged for scrap metal during World War II. What's left is silence, and water, and stumps, and the wood. The cypress in houses that are still standing. The siding that doesn't rot. The shingles that last 50 years. All of it cut by men whose names we don't know, dragged over roads that shouldn't have worked, through swamps that killed without mercy. That's the legacy, not the engineering. Not the ingenuity of corduroy roads or the efficiency of pole roads. The legacy is that we built an entire industry on a willingness to let men die for timber. And we did it so well that the wood is still here and the men are forgotten. Before engines powerful enough to work in swamps, before equipment that could float, before we admitted that some timber wasn't worth the cost. We had this. Roads made from the same trees we were trying to haul. Men standing in water, building surfaces that would rot in 2 years, so that logs could be dragged to mills that would process them into houses for people who would never see a swamp. It worked, huh? Until it didn't. And when it stopped working, we moved on. Left the swamps to recover, left the men to be forgotten. That's the truth of it. The cypress is still here, the men aren't. And we owe them a debt we can't pay because we don't even know their names. The last operating corduroy road in a Louisiana cypress swamp was abandoned in 1924. The last pole road in Mississippi lasted until 1931. By then, gasoline engines and crawler tractors had made swamp logging possible without building roads from trees. The new methods were faster, cheaper, and killed fewer men per 1,000 board feet. Progress. We call it progress, and maybe it was. But it came 70 years too late for the men who built roads from cypress to move cypress, for the men who drowned in water that was warm enough to breed disease and cold enough to kill you from exposure, for the men whose names are lost because companies cared more about production records than personnel records. What remains is the wood. And the knowledge that every board foot of old-growth cypress you see in a 100-year-old house represents a choice to build roads that rotted, to work men in water that killed them, to prioritize profit over survival. We made that choice. For 40 years, we made it every day. And the wood is still here to prove it worked. That's not a celebration. That's a confession.